All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Joukowsky Institute for Archaeology in the Ancient World. My name is Matt Riley, and I'm a visiting assistant professor here at Brown with a cross appointment at the Archaeology Institute and across campus at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, the sponsor for this event. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you all to tonight's lecture, which will be given by Professor Margaret Ellen Newell. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I'd like to point out that tonight marks the first event in a series of community lectures, panels, and discussions that will take place throughout the academic year under the banner of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. This national organization serves to honor the lives of those enslaved Africans and their descendants who experienced the terrors of the Middle Passage across the Atlantic and the brutalities of slavery in the Americas. As of last January, this national organization has officially expanded to include a Rhode Island branch. Committees have since been established in port towns of Newport, Bristol, Warren, and here in Providence to design and place port markers in each of these communities to acknowledge the role of these Rhode Island ports in the trade of enslaved bodies, both indigenous and African, and to pay respect to the enslaved peoples who passed through and labored in and around these places. Given the theme of this evening's lecture, and in recognizing that these histories are not solely relegated to the past, I'd like to acknowledge the Nihontik Nahagansett Nation, the Pokanoket Nation, the Nipmuc Nation, the Pequot Nation, and the Wampanoag communities that called and still call this place home. As we move forward with these events, I think it's important to recognize the enduring consequences of these histories in our daily lives in spaces like this campus, this city, and this state. Throughout the coming months, we'll be hosting events that feature scholars who have recently published groundbreaking research that speak to Rhode Island's entangled history with slavery, as well as its legacies. Details about future events will be released shortly, so please sign up for our mailing list on the Rhode Island website for the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. This series has been made possible through the hard work of the Research Committee for the Providence branch, so I'd like to thank Karen DeBruin, Earl Smith, Peter Fay, and Lynn Fisher for their efforts and insights in making this series and this event a reality. This event is made possible through the support of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and I'd also like to thank, in particular, Shana Weinberg, the Assistant Director of the CSSJ, for all of her hard work. While this event is sponsored by the CSSJ, the series is part of a broader collaborative effort made possible through the generous support of the John Carter Brown Library's Collaboration Grant, with additional support coming from the History Department here at Brown and the University of Rhode Island. So thank you to all parties for making this all happen. And now, without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Margaret Ellen Newell. This is a homecoming of sorts for Professor Newell, who did her undergraduate work in history and Spanish right here at Brown University, and I also found out she was also on the field hockey team. So she is currently the professor and vice chair of the history department at Ohio State University, where she has been a faculty member since 1991. She received her PhD from the University of Virginia with a dissertation exploring the development of economic ideologies in early colonial New England. This work inspired her first book, published in 1998 with Cornell University Press, entitled From Dependency to Independence: Economic Revolution in Colonial New England. Since that time, her work has slightly shifted to more explicitly focus on the undeniable significance of American Indian slavery in New England economics and society. The result of this research is her new book, published just last year in 2015, again with Cornell University Press, entitled Brethren by Nature: New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery. The book provides a new framework for analyzing infamous events in the history of colonist-indigenous relations, such as the Pequot Wars and King Philip's War. In the book, Professor Newell explores the 17th century New England history through a framework that privileges the role played by indigenous captives in the shaping of laws and practices surrounding slavery and freedom that came to have a tremendous impact on how slavery was conceptualized, institutionalized, and experienced, not just in New England, but throughout the Atlantic world. The book was recently awarded the 2016 James A. Rowley Prize for the best book on the history of race relations in the United States, awarded by the Organization of American Historians. Copies of the book are currently on sale outside the lecture hall, and after her talk, Professor Newell will be available to sign copies of her work. So please take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. I have my own copy here, so I strongly encourage you guys to have a read and buy a copy. Professor Newell is the recipient of many prestigious awards and fellowships, including a National Endowment for the Humanities Research Fellowship, an Andrew Mellon Fellowship at Huntington Library, and multiple fellowships that brought her back here to Brown, including the John Nicholas Brown Center Research Fellowship and 2 John Carter Brown Library Fellowships. Finally, given the Middle Passage Ceremony and Port Markers Project's goal of developing educational strategies about slavery and the slave trade, I'd like to add that Professor Newell has participated in a number of seminars for teachers about Native American history in education. This evening, she'll be sharing a talk based on material from her book, again available outside the lecture hall for those interested, entitled A Native Indian of New England Born and Free Man, Stories of Indian Slavery and Freedom in Colonial Rhode Island. Please join me in welcoming Professor Margaret Ellen Newell.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks very much also to the Center for inviting me here, to Shana for making all the arrangements for my visit. And, I love Brown. I had a wonderful experience as an undergraduate here. It's what inspired me to become a history professor and academic. And I've continued to come back and use the fabulous resources on this campus for my research, and in Rhode Island in general. Some of my best stories, some of my best Indian biographies, I found either in the Rhode Island Judicial Records Center in Pawtucket, in the Rhode Island Historical Society, or in the John Carter Brown Library. So places right around here have some rich stories and histories to tell us. And so I'm very grateful to this community for making a lot of my research possible. So I feel like I got a great introduction from Matt. So my book is about New England in general. I try to provide an overview of Indian slavery over a 150-year period, and talk about its origins, its development, and different stages that I discussed over time. And what I wanted to do today is pull out some of the Rhode Island stories, and I'll try to convey the general argument of my book by telling some of these stories about individual enslaved persons and their experiences and a variety of roles within New England society. And I want to encourage people to stop me along the way. If you have any questions, if something catches your eye, I'd like to talk a little bit more about it right then rather than waiting to the end, please do. So my book begins with the enslavement of Indians in the context of the Pequot War, which pitted the English colonies of New England against the Pequot Nation. And along with the English colonies, the Narragansetts and the emerging Mohegan tribe and Niantics participated as allies of the English against the Pequots in this particular conflict. I argue that although the Pequot War began for a complex set of reasons, geopolitical reasons, that included conflicts amongst the English colonies about territory and expansion and control of Indian trade, conflicts among Native American groups about some of the same things, about who would control trade with Europeans, about conflicts between English and Dutch settlers over access to Indian trade. So there were really, really complex geopolitical challenges confronting both the Europeans and the Indians in the run-up to the Pequot War. But I argue that despite this complex set of origins, that taking captives quickly became a main purpose of the war once it had already started. And that even at the very onset, the very first expedition, it was actually sent to Block Island, not to Pequot country, from Massachusetts Bay. Their main instruction was to take captives. The very early reconnaissance missions to Pequot country took captives. In fact, so much so that the Connecticut settlers who were besieged in Saybrook Fort were complaining that the Massachusetts forces were taking Pequot captives instead of relieving the siege, bringing them food, et cetera, et cetera. So the taking of captives was an imperative, was a goal for many of the officers, individuals who participated in these armies that the English colonists put together. And I argue that part of the purpose and part of this sense of urgency on the part of the English was the labor shortage. The first generation of English servants had finished their terms, and people served usually 7-year terms. 1637, people they brought with them in 1630 were ending their terms, and everybody's talking about a labor shortage. The English colonists are complaining about a shortage of labor. The Pequots increased the available labor pool by 1/3, which I think is a significant number. So I've been able to track about 348 Pequots who were enslaved and taken into English households, mostly starting out in the Boston area. But they experienced a dispersal as people left Boston for religious reasons, fleeing religious persecution, banished for their religious beliefs, like Roger Williams and others, meant that these Pequot captives got scattered and brought into other communities within New England. And some of them also tried to run away. I found an interesting case in the papers of Roger Williams. Williams was assigned the role of runaway catcher. For despite his banishment, he still maintained very close ties with his former colleagues in Boston and Plymouth, and did a lot of services for them, both before and during and after the war. And people, when their Pequots ran away, they would contact Williams and try to get him to get these enslaved people back. And Williams did. Williams was one of the few people, Williams and John Eliot are about the only two English people who ever expressed any qualms about the appropriateness of Indian enslavement, whether it was a good strategy, whether it was morally justifiable. But Williams was very implicated in Indian slavery in many other ways. So Williams was told that these captives had run away to Narragansett country. So he pressed the Narragansett leader, Miantinomo, and also the Niantic leader, Nyanemo, for news about runaways. The treaty that ended the Pequot War had actually included a fugitive slave clause. This is a treaty that theoretically these other Indian allies signed. So Narragansetts and the Niantics had been forced to ink a deal that included a fugitive slave clause and said they themselves would be subject to enslavement if they tried to protect any runaways. And these fugitive slave acts were reiterated over and over again throughout the 17th century in English diplomacy. So they constantly reiterated this point, you face enslavement if you try to protect a runaway. So I think people often assume that it was easy for Native Americans to run away because they knew the countryside. Think about for the Pequots, the relatives had been killed, the survivors had been dispersed. There was no home, in the short term, there was no home to return to. These were long distances that people had to travel. So the Narragansetts really tried to avoid turning captives over. They had taken a share of captives themselves, but had settled them as tributaries, as groups and families within their territory. So Indians sought captives to increase their numbers, to increase their economic productivity, but not necessarily as slaves. The Narragansetts said we will give them houses and fields, that they will become part of our group, part of our society. So this was the Narragansett idea. They wanted high status captives to perhaps marry and then be able to seek positions of leadership within the communities these people came from too. So that the idea of marrying captives was something that other Native American groups were interested in doing, especially if they were people of high status. So this meant the Narragansetts were particularly reluctant to give up women, especially if they were high status, if they were runaways. But the English put tremendous pressure on the Narragansetts. And finally, the Narragansetts produced 3 captive women, all of whom had run away from Boston. The Narragansetts said they found them starving in the woods, very footsore from their journey. It was fall, it was cold, so they had experienced a lot of hardship in making this escape. One of them belonged to William Blackstone. The Blackstone Valley is named after him. A minister who would actually soon move to this area, I think possibly because this Pequot slave kept running away. She was coming to this region for some reason. He sort of followed her, more or less. So to bring her closer, probably because she had relatives here she was trying to get closer to. The other woman we don't know too much about. She was from a Boston community of Native Americans, so she wasn't even running to the people. She was just running away from Boston. The third woman was a Pequot, and she told Williams a harrowing story of her treatment. She said she had been a servant in the home of Robert Coles, who owned an inn in Boston, the Inn. It's a place where diplomacy took place. It's a place where dignitaries were housed when they came to visit the colony, both Native American dignitaries and foreign dignitaries. And in this inn, she'd been abused by the English servants. She'd been raped. She'd been beaten with gun stocks. She'd experienced really horrible treatment at the hands of other servants, possibly Coles, maybe visitors to the inn. She herself had been punished for fornication as a result of the rape and had been burned by the town beadle. She was burned with hot iron as punishment for, a sexual crime against herself. Williams returned her to Coles and returned the other women to Boston too. But they were all branded again with the mark of the runaway on their arms. So the Pequot captives experienced very different fates depending on their gender, depending on the person who might have enslaved them, depending on the status that Europeans associated with them. So evidence that some Pequots were actually released at the end of a set term, just like indentured servants, maybe a 7 or 10-year term. But women tended to be less likely if they were women, and much less likely for people who were not identified as high status, or people who had sort of unique ties that could be leveraged to power and influence and diplomacy with other Native American tribes. So my guess is that these women all remained slaves for life. So in this part of the story, I'm also trying to explore what slavery meant in the early part of the 17th century. So some of you are taking a class on slavery more broadly at this point. I mean, there's, slavery is a complex and evolving system in the 17th century. There are overlapping forms of unfreedom going on. There's sort of a spectrum. So the kind of slavery you associate with the 19th century is not quite in place yet. Whether slavery is inheritable or not, that's not quite clear. Whether whose status the child follows, the father's or the mother, not entirely clear. Is slavery a racially based system or not? Still not very clear in the middle of the 17th century. So I argue that, in fact, the desire to keep these Pequot captives clarified some of these issues in the minds of the New England colonists, because they passed the first slave law in English America. So before Barbados, before Virginia, it was Massachusetts that passed the first law that defined who could be enslaved. Now what's interesting is the absence of any racialized language here. There had already been some laws passed in Bermuda and Barbados about controlling behavior of Negroes. They didn't really say anything about slavery yet. So this law doesn't say anything about race, but it does say who can be enslaved. And it's lawful captives taken in just wars, such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us, and those assigned to by authority. So that, in other words, the government can sentence people to slavery. So those were the categories of the enslaved. Unlike later legislation in Barbados and Virginia, this law did not exempt Christians. So you could convert to Christianity and still remain a slave. You could be Christian and be made a slave under these rubrics. Whereas Barbados and Virginia, for at least a couple decades, Christian conversion could get you out of slavery, and was a strategy that people used to escape slavery. So interestingly, the place that we associate with religion and evangelization did not exempt people from enslavement on its basis. So this rather vague law remained the law of slavery in Massachusetts and really for most of the rest of the region for the entire colonial period and into the early republic. It was updated in the 1670s, but the language wasn't changed very much. And what's missing from that law that you would associate with slavery? Let me ask you. Pardon? Yeah, I mean, race is certainly missing. I mean, you could say that it does say they can be strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. So they're leaving an opening for, they know about the African slave trade. They have their children are working, and have worked at Barbados. They're sticking their children as merchants in these places. These families generally followed almost Atlantic strategy, and the Winthrops, had a child in Bilbao, had a child in Barbados, and later in Antigua, later in Cadiz. I mean, they knew which all be slave market trade. So they know about the slave trade, and it's how it's sort of emerging in the Caribbean. And there's ships moving back and forth, Virginia, New England, eventually to the Caribbean. Everybody knows what these other places are doing. They're interested in these emerging institutions. They're not all following the same playbook, but they're certainly aware of the other playbooks. But that's, so the African slave trade's in the mix. Anything else that anybody sees as, yeah, sure.
What's missing there are the slaves that were produced by the English owners themselves.
Like,
their children.
Their children. Yes, so there's nothing about inheritability here. And there's never a positive law that lays out heritability in New England for the entire colonial period. So, or terms, right. So right, exactly. So this, it's out there, but it's somewhat vague, and there's not much change made to this. So, one of the things I talk about in the book is that this meant that in some ways, slavery became what communities made it. Slavery was what people could get away with. So what a putative master could get away with in terms of claiming someone's labor for life and then trying to claim their children after that. So individual, putative masters, would-be masters, would try to claim the labor of people over generations, but there wasn't necessarily a firm legal support for that sort of behavior. So this meant, the community really had to support these decisions for them to work. So we'll talk about some efforts that people made to make it a heritable system without these legal backing. Now, what else is, the other thing that's missing here, or what you might be familiar with, or might be reading about, or have read about, are the black codes or the black laws. Laws that stripped people of color of different sorts of rights. That one by one, most of the slave societies wrote into their slave law. And in fact, the New England colonies did eventually pass these sorts of laws. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But one thing I did notice was that between the Pequot War and the next major conflict in New England pitting English against Indians, which was King Philip's War, that they started writing what I do call Indian laws. They're sort of like the black laws, except they weren't aimed at an enslaved population. They were aimed at the population of free Indians, and they really kind of created an environment in which Indians and slavery, were lined up next to each other. So for example, Connecticut passed a series of laws that gave individuals who felt they'd been wronged by the Indians, as well as any kind of government official, a sheriff or beadle, the right to command horses and boats to chase fugitive slaves. Individual colonies reiterated these fugitive slave laws from the treaties that said any Indian who is helped to run away or protected to run away could themselves be enslaved. These laws also gave individual English people the right to claim Indian bodies if they suffered some sort of economic crime committed by an Indian, trespassing, theft or use of a horse, damage to livestock. They could go take these Indians and sell them. So, for example, a man named Thomas Minor, who's living in Narragansett country, got a certificate from the United Colonies, which is a group of all the New England colonies. They gave them permission to seize any two Indian men in the sachendom of a man named Shabbatak, because Minor claimed that they had stolen some of his horses. He could take any two men and sell them for 20 pounds, and whoever bought them could export them to Barbados. So they're using Barbados and the Caribbean as almost an idea of slavery, the worst kind of possible slavery one could end up in this period. These are partly scare tactics, but they're real. So here's the state empowering someone to just go out and take, random innocent person and enslave them as a kind of retribution for an economic act. And so Connecticut passes laws like this. Massachusetts and Plymouth pass laws like this. So this is sort of a language and an idea. And then someone who's living in Rhode Island appeals to a central authority to get, because Rhode Island doesn't have such a law, he goes to the United Colonies and a kind of overarching rubric to get that kind of endorsement and permission. So we see laws that kind of echo or precede the black laws being implemented, creating this notion that Indians can be enslaved for a variety of activities. The next major conflict in New England pitting Indians against English was King Philip's War. And my take on King Philip's War is very similar to my take on the Pequot War. I think this is a war about taking captives. I think, in fact, in this one you can see that his origins are in part Indian. Metacom Philip mentions the taking of captives, the coercion of Indian labor, alongside the expropriation of Indian land as a key issue for his desire to kind of create an Indian alliance against the English. I mean, so he mentions this is a grievance. Outside observers mention the Indians' grievances and justifiable grievances on these grounds. And again, the conduct of this war very much reflected a desire of individual soldiers and commanders to take captives. So, I mean, people just took captives along the way, between battles. So this is Thomas Oliver, sort of was writing reports back to Boston about the progress of the war. At this point, forces from Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay were marching into Narragansett country. And this is the point at which the Narragansetts are entering the war. Rhode Island's put to the torch, and this is the moment where the conflict really starts to escalate. They were chasing refugees from people who are really in many ways just fleeing battlefields. In many cases, women and children who are just trying to get away from the fighting that had already broken out in Plymouth between the Plymouth colony soldiers and the Wampanoags. So a lot of Wampanoags, women and children especially, other groups, the Cassets who weren't involved in the conflict, these people were on the move. When you think about the refugee crisis today, right? People are trying to get away from horrible violence, and they're on the move. They're very vulnerable at these moments when they're on the move. So these army groups were really just snatching up these captives, and in some cases selling them on the spot. So Oliver basically, sold them to another officer. They would take these prisoners and try to get, turn them, flip them as quickly as possible, so they weren't burdened by carrying a lot of prisoners with them. So there's all these informal sales along the way that we don't have good records of. We also do have some records of Indians that were brought back or sent back to Boston, Plymouth, Connecticut, and some of the Rhode Island towns during the war for sale as well, though, by these officers. So this was actually the document that sparked this book. And I was working on my economic history and looking at the records of John Hull, who was a Boston merchant. I stumbled across this page in his account book. Now, Hull was actually the treasurer of Massachusetts Bay during King Philip's War. I'm looking at his book and I'm seeing he's selling Indians. Right, so here Samuel Shrimpton buys 4 squaws, 3 girls, 2 infants. Ditto, 1 old man, 3 squaws, 1 returned. This was a wrongful, we actually took, someone whose relative had been fighting with the English. He actually sent this person to Jamaica, had to get them back from Jamaica, wrongfully enslaved. Mistake, which happened a lot in this conflict. I mean, Christian Indians, friendly Indians, they were Indians who were fighting with the English against the Indians. Their families were kidnapped and enslaved while they were in battle, while they were away serving with the English. Their families were subject to enslavement and kidnapping. So there's sort of a free-for-all going on. Thomas Smith gets 10 squaws, 8 papooses, and 1 man. So when you see, these are family groups, there's a lot of women and children. These are not combatants. These are not soldiers. These are not people who are involved in the conflict. They're people trying to escape the conflict in many cases. Shrimpton sent at least 6 of the people he bought at this particular auction. And these were auctions. And you have to think, Boston, Providence, Edgartown and Martha's Vineyard, small towns all through New England had a public venue, the camera, the auction, and everything. And that's what's happening to these people. They're being auctioned, public auction. People are buying them. So I mentioned before that even people who were trying to escape the conflict often found themselves kidnapped. And I know you are studying the Middle Passage. You have a program, marker program about the Middle Passage. But the people who do Native American slavery are now talking about a reverse Middle Passage and the exportation of Indians from North America into Atlantic slavery all over the globe. So I found evidence of Indians from New England, being exported to Bermuda, to Barbados, to Jamaica, to the Lesser Antilles, possibly to Madagascar, so the Indian Ocean. And it just, as it turns out, in this particular conflict, a number of New England Indians ended up sent to Europe, North Africa, and to the Azores, the Azores Islands, because that's where the ships were going at that moment to trade and other sorts of goods. So some of where the Indians go sort of depended on where the most active trade was at that particular moment. During King Philip's War, the government put a ban on trade to the Caribbean. So that was a provisions trade. That was where they were sending food, sending corn, sending wheat, pork to feed the slave system there. But food was so short during the war because the war, they burned cornfields. They burned Indian cornfields, destroyed Indian food. Indians burned English cornfields, killed English livestock. There's a food crisis going on as this war, rolls on and rolls on and rolls on. It banned trade with Caribbean. And in fact, went to a trading partner to whom they had brought provisions in the past, but became a source of provisions during the war, which is the Azores. Azores. People around here say Azores. Portuguese say Açores. So these are volcanic islands. Just get a sense of this distance. New England doesn't even show up in this map. That's Nova Scotia up there. If you look at a Google map, that's the coast of. There's Portugal. There's West Africa. So this is the environment that the Azores are in. So they were a crossroads. They were a place that were a crossroads in the Atlantic slave trade. So slave ships would sometimes provision there, either before they went to Africa or on the way back. So there was a place that was supplying provisions for a lot of crisscrossing trade. So you could find cloth from Africa, goods from Europe, wine from the nearby wine islands, Madeira, and so on and so forth. and then Caribbean goods are all moving, back and forth through the Azores Islands. And they have a kind of a slave sale area called the Pilgrim so there were public auctions of slaves. So Cadiz in Spain was also a huge, huge slave port in this period. People from Africa, from the Middle East, and from Africa are being bought and sold in Cadiz in Spain. So New England Indians ended up in both of these slave markets, in the Azores and in Cadiz. So at a place like the Azores, they might be doing agricultural work, they might be working in homes, they might be doing construction. In North Africa, they were building seawalls in the British port of Tangier. They were rowing English galleys, they were galley slaves, rowing galleys for the English Navy in the Mediterranean. So they were fulfilling, a variety of functions in these particular societies. So Jack and his family were Narragansett Indians who traveled seasonally in the area around Prudence Island. So they went back and forth sort of from the mainland to the island in sort of seasonal migrations, subsistence migrations. And for years they had come to the same area of Prudence Island and had planted near some employees of a man named John Payne. Now, John Payne had received the island, the kind of deed to Prudence Island from Metacomet, from King Philip. Philip was trying to create, I think, a number of English people that would defend Metacomet's claim to land ownership. So one way to do that was to actually create a lot of interested English people. By giving them land or leasing land to them, it made them support the Indians' land titles and land claims. That the legitimacy was a gift from Metacomet, then you're recognizing that Metacomet actually controls a much larger territory. So I think a lot of Indian leaders over time are doing things like that, try to create buffers of friendly Europeans close to Indian settlements to get between them and the more hostile Europeans to protect in the long term, at least some of their land and assets. So Metacomet had given this land to Payne, and Payne kind of had a sort of sharecropping system. So he had both Indian and English people living on the island that would just sort of give them some of their crops, or they would do work for Payne on Payne's land too. Payne had some separate farms. But then these people could do their own thing and raise their own crops, engage in their own subsistence. So Jack and his family had sort of cycled through and had done this for many years apparently. By 1675, they were very known to the other English residents, who all testified to their kind of community, to the fact that they were a community. They called Jack and his family, they were livers on this island with the English. And this is a kind of relationship I do try to highlight in my book, is that not all relationships between English and Indians were hostile. In fact, most weren't. There were many positive interactions, or certainly many interactions that fell short of violence and enslavement. To me, this is one of the things that makes Indian slavery almost, so compelling, is that given that, the many kinds of daily interactions, the mutual assistance, the dependence of the English on the Indians for so many decades, the interest that the English really had in Native American culture, the prevalence of a lot of Native Americans as wage workers, as guides, as allies in various conflicts. These people are socializing with each other all the time. They're in and out of each other's houses all the time, not just on Prudence Island, but everywhere in New England. They're not living far apart. They're living really close together. And the English settle right near where the Indians are. They don't try to create physical space at first, at least, and really for most of the period. They're densely close together. They're very intermeshed in each other's lives. So they're enslaving people they met when they enslaved Indians, in many cases. They're enslaving people they view as just like them, as human beings. And this kind of idea is reiterated over and over again in the 17th century, this sort of basic sameness of Indians and English, despite cultural differences, that they're at the core, they're the same kinds of people. They're enslaving the same kinds of people as themselves. To me, that is something that is interesting. Why people do that? That's a question that needs to be answered. So Jack and his family have been doing this for years and years. Jack seems to have realized that this conflict was coming. He warns his English neighbors that conflict is coming. The Narragansetts are not in the war yet, but they see, the pressure on them is intense. They are trying to shelter Wampanoags and Pocasset who are fleeing the battlefield. The English are coming after the Narragansetts to give up these refugees, putting tons of pressure on them to give up refugees. So it's the pursuit of captives is widening the war because of the aggression of these armies. So it's at this moment, Jack actually entered into an indenture. He made himself a servant of John Payne. Gave up some modicum of his freedom and entered into a contractual agreement to be a servant of John Payne. And in exchange, Payne was going to give him a pass, a paper. Because by this time, New England colonies were demanding that Indians have passes, that they wear badges, to establish their bona fides as people who were loyal to the English. And so one way to prove that was actually be a servant of the English. So, the sort of pass system is coming into play, where all Indians are supposed to have some sort of pass, some sort of certificate of good behavior, to prove that they are a friend, not foe. If they don't have any certificates, they're subject to seizure, enslavement, or execution. So this is Jack's gamble. He'll bind himself to Payne to avoid the bigger problem. This move does not protect the family or the friends and relatives who are visiting Jack. They're all kidnapped one evening by two captains from the Massachusetts and Plymouth forces who converged and are marching on Narragansett. They burst into these people's homes at night and just drag them on board, shackle them, and sell them to and sell them to the Azores. And they're, that's I lose track of it. Now, Massachusetts and Plymouth held public auctions of captives at the center. So the government ran these auctions, the government in Boston, the government in Plymouth. They're sort of top-down affairs in which generally, wealthy Bostonians bought most of those captives and either, sold them and exported them or deployed them on their many establishments. So most of these people had, 3, 4, 5 different establishments, homes, farms, other sorts of enterprises. They went that way for that reason. But Connecticut and Rhode Island did things differently. Connecticut and Rhode Island both allowed the towns to determine the sale or the future of captives. And so rather than a top-down process, in these places it was more of a bottom-up process, if that makes sense. And one account, there's a very vivid account in the Provincetown records of one of these processes. It was supervised by Roger Williams. So in the summer of 1676, the Provincetown meeting met under a tree by the waterside, because so much of the town had been destroyed in the war. The colonists were angry. They had lost people in this war. They had lost property in this war. They were vengeful. And these were very tense discussions, too, because there was money at stake. The money at stake was the money to be made from the dozens and dozens of captives that the Provincetown meeting controlled. So they basically, under this tree, by the water, they paraded these captives, who were not shackled but were bound, into the center, and decided who was going to be enslavable out of this group, which was everybody, except one individual that they executed on the spot. The people demanded that they said they would lynch the guy if the meeting in Williams didn't actually do it in a more official fashion. So they assembled a hasty firing squad and executed this particular Native American individual. His nickname was Chuff because of his surly attitude. So they executed Chuff, lined everybody else up, mostly women and children, a few men as well, and then sort of figured out a process. And the process they used was the process they kind of used to divide land and share land that had also been expropriated from the Indians, the share system. So everyone was to get a share in the profits from the sale of these Indians. Individuals could use that share right away to actually buy an Indian. They could right away buy an Indian just using goods. So people, bought Indians using wool, sheep wool, and other sorts of farm commodities right on the spot. So a number of people in the town bought some of these Indians on the spot. The rest were bundled upon into a ship commanded by Providence Williams, Roger Williams' son, and taken to Newport and sold to auction. So this process was replicated in town after town, Portsmouth, and then in various Connecticut towns. Connecticut followed a very similar process, did the same thing. This is actually a gun that was in the Williams family in the 1660s and 1670s. It's also part of the Rhode Island Historical Society collections. So I think that the presence of the enslaved people created a lot of wealth and a lot of economic mobility for the English. That Indian labor was crucial to building this economy. People were enslaving Indians for economic motives, because of the profit it brought. So Richard Arnold's acquired an Indian man named Sam. He might have bought him at one of these auctions, might have acquired him in some other way. One of the interesting things about this story is that Sam brought relatives with him to live in and around the Arnold household. So Sam was the only Indian that Arnold expressed ownership over. But at any given time, there were at least 9 other Indians living around and near and working in the Arnold household who were related to Sam, including a number of women, up to 6 women at any given time. So they would pound corn. So in this period, somebody in the house had to spend at least 3 hours a day just grinding corn or wheat for flour to bake bread. If you think about how much work is involved in these households, how much manual labor actually went into household work, not just agricultural work, and processing all of these agricultural commodities for consumption by the family. So unless there was a mill nearby, grinding corn was an incredibly laborious thing, something that Native American women did and did well. So these sorts of services are very important. Watching children, cooking for the family. These were important services. So female labor was very valued in these households. So Arnold, served as getting an incredible deal. For the one enslaved person, he was getting maybe as many as 8 or 9 other laborers working in his farm, in his house, providing all these different services. We know about this situation because one of the Indians, Margaret, died showing Arnold how to operate a canoe. She drowned. There was an inquest into her death, and that's how this whole household organization was exposed. But we also know that Richard Arnold, in this period and soon after, experienced a lot of mobility. He became much wealthier. He became eventually a member of the Rhode Island legislature. So having Indian slaves gave people time to do other things, to become justices of the peace, to serve in political office, to do things that brought more wealth, access to land, access to fees and money and salary, and so on and so forth. So this was an engine of wealth for people. And this is actually a ceremonial feast bowl, a samp bowl it was called. Samp is a cornmeal mush stew that was purportedly looted from King Philip's own home in Mount Hope. So in the 18th century, the wars continued against Indians on the northeastern frontier of New England. And New Englanders attempted to enslave those Indians too. So this was the Wabanaki Confederacy. This war was actually ignited at the tail end of King Philip's War because, again, refugees were fleeing from battlefields, fleeing enslavement, were not just moving south and west away from battlefields, they were also fleeing north. So they were fleeing into what is today New Hampshire and Maine, which is Wabanaki territory, and seeking shelter with often relatives and other kin and connections there. So the colonial authorities and the British, the English, were really trying to keep the Wabanaki out of this war. And they pretty much succeeded through the time that they captured and killed Philip and really destroyed and disrupted the Wampanoag Confederacy. But soon after, the war with the Wabanaki did break out. So by the end of 1676, conflict really started to break out with the Wabanaki, partly because of a lot of kidnapping of Wabanaki. So the kind of thing that went on with the kidnapping of Jack and his family, other associates around the same time kidnapped a bunch of high status, high ranking Penobscot Indians and also sent them to the Azores. So Colony actually went back and got them and brought them back. Did not bother with Jack and his family. Did bring the high status Wabanaki back. But there were a series of these really dramatic, egregious kidnappings. One of them involved bringing 180, 200 Indians that were in for a kind of peace conference war game. It was billed as we're staging a war game. All these people were kidnapped and sent off to Atlantic slavery. So war with the Wabanaki became a new reality for New England. So the New England colonies were at war with the Wabanaki for almost 70 years in the wake of King Philip's War. And these are wars that are pretty existential for New England because the Wabanaki are somewhat allied with Iroquois Indians, with Iroquois Christian Indians, with the French Empire at different times. Wabanaki are independent. They are not anybody's subject, but they have alliances and connections with these other groups. And this is, the New England nightmare. Is, the Iroquois and the French in the mix. That's maybe an existential crisis. Threatens the very existence of New England. So they do try to enslave these Indians. They do enslave these Indians. And Wabanaki are auctioned off in Boston and elsewhere, as they had in other wars. But the Wabanaki can take captives too. They take a lot of English captives. This is the era of the famous captivity narratives. Many of them are people who are captured by the Wabanaki. Hannah Dunstan, Mary Rowlandson, and others. And there are many Indians actually fighting with the English colonists in these wars. People like Benjamin Church are famous and are valued by both the British and the local authorities. So this is a guy who lived on Little Compton, Tiverton area, on Indian land essentially. So he basically ran almost a kind of Spanish-style encomienda. After the war, he basically told these Indians, he took plenty of slaves during the war, and sold them and brought them in. And he also had a group of Indians. He would offer people a kind of battlefield decision, like join my forces or I'm going to kill you right now. So they would join his forces. So at the end of the war, he said, stay with me and work for me, and I'll keep people from lynching you. And some people took that deal too. So he had a group of Indians that were living with him on his estate and working for him as unpaid tenants and unpaid workers. And he also expected them to engage in military service. So, at any given time in these wars of the late 17th century and 18th century, 20% of the forces were Indians from southern New England. So you have to think of these wars not as wars of English against Indians, but English and Indians against Indians, French, and other groups. So essential were these Indian recruits that some of the royal authorities, British authorities, really started saying, telling the colonists, you have to stop doing this stuff. First of all, if you take captives, then the Wabanaki feel justified in taking both English and Indian captives. If you're not going to treat people like soldiers, on the other side, they're not going to treat either you or your Indian soldiers as people who are protected by the rules of war. So the British authorities are really trying to assert a notion of Indian citizenship. Indians as part of the empire, as really as equal to the English colonists. Another group that are part of the English empire, subjects to the king, of equal value, of equal purpose within that imperial system. Not inferior peoples that should be subjected to slavery. And over time, the colonists start getting that message because they have to try to protect their own people from these mass enslavements. By the 1740s, the colonists themselves have sort of agreed that they can't really enslave Indians in these wars anymore, at least Indians from New England. And this is a peace medal given by the English to the Wabanaki in one of the interim events in these wars. So this is Church's. This is the area, some of the area that Church lived in. But this is former Indian land. You can see it's all chopped up in the house lots. This is. I mean, these landscapes are changing in 10, 20, 30 years from Indian territory in Rhode Island to this. So you can't enslave Indians in war anymore. So King Philip's War had basically brought all of the Indians of southern New England into the jurisdiction of the New England colonies. They were now subjects of those individual colonies. By later in the 18th century, the British are telling them they can't enslave Indians in northern New England, even though those Indians are not part of their jurisdiction. They still can't enslave them either. So what do? You still want labor. You can't enslave the local Indians. At least there's no war or process that lets you do that in a kind of legal familiar framework, or certainly not a process that lets you enslave lots of people at one time once the wars are over in southern New England. So what I found was that there's an uptick in what I call judicial enslavement, the sentencing of Indians to servitude by courts. And a uptick in, or at least I'm able to track more and more of these cases in which people are simply, converting people into slaves, deciding they're going to claim people as slaves, or trying to claim the children of people who had been servants or people taken captive in the war that were only supposed to be term servants, were only going to be supposed to serve for set times. So there's a lot of variation within New England, but Connecticut and Rhode Island had essentially, in the last year of the war, had said that these people are not supposed to be slaves for life. So if they're not combatants, if they weren't soldiers, if they're women and children especially, they are to be term servants. That they could be kept up till age 30. And Rhode Island also said you can charge people room and board for the time of their servants and tack that on to the term of service if they're young children. But they were not supposed to be enslaved. Rhode Island actually banned Indian slavery after King Philip's War. So, theoretically, all of these captives should have been freed after a term of anywhere from 2 to 28 years. So 28 should have been an absolute maximum, and that would have been for somebody who was an infant at the time of capture during King Philip's War. But in reality, what was happening is people were not freeing these Indians at the end of a set term. They were trying to keep them for life, and they were trying to keep their children after them. Even people who were casual wage workers were in danger of being converted to servants and then into slaves. So I mean, it's like a case-by-case thing, in which people are literally just converting people into slaves if they can, under certain circumstances. So Rachel Prentice was a Narragansett Indian child captive people actually tried to move into Connecticut as part of these refugee flows to get away from the violence, and because they had also heard that Massachusetts and Plymouth were selling Indians, exporting them to the Caribbean, exporting them to Europe. I mean, people had heard what was happening. This happens in the first month of the war. The first group gets sent out. So, word is out in Indian country. So people are trying to move away from Massachusetts and Plymouth and into other areas. So refugees are flooding into Connecticut. So Rachel sold in Connecticut, and she's purchased by a magistrate and a captain called John Prentice. And she lives until 1746, and she's eulogized by another justice of the peace as a faithful servant who served the Prentice household. Under Connecticut law, at maximum she should have been freed in around 1700. She's still serving in 1746. She married an enslaved African in another household named York, and had a daughter. Their daughter is still being litigated over. It's still not a fully free person, even after Rachel Prentice's death. So John Prentice manumits their daughter. He actually tries to create a legal manumission, and his heirs contest this. She's still working for one daughter as a servant, and the wages are going to another daughter, and there's no sign that she's going to be free. Her children then are going to be stuck in the same trap. Ben was a Rhode Island Indian who may have been part of that auction, part of that group that Providence Williams brought to Newport, where they were auctioned off after the Providence town meeting. And he was bought by William Coddington. And Coddington died, and his wife remarried. She married a man named Eves, who moved the family to Pennsylvania, took Ben, and converted him to a slave there. So years later, Ben filed a petition in Pennsylvania asking that he either be given a set term that had a finite end for when his service would end, or that he be freed, because he had already served basically his legal term based on his age under Rhode Island law. Now, Ben was illiterate. He signed his petition with a mark. I don't know how he got the means, the social capital, the assistance in filing this petition, because it's, I have examples of these petitions and legal actions. Only a fraction of Native Americans had access to this sort of activity. The social capital, the cost, the literacy, everything it took. You had to have people backing you. You had to have patrons. Sometimes those patrons just wanted the labor of these enslaved persons themselves. It wasn't always an altruistic act. So, it was a titanic achievement for someone like Ben to be able to pull off something like this petition. And he succeeded enough that Rhode Island put together a big file on it. But I don't know the outcome of this case. Maybe Lynn may know, I'm not sure. Ruth Cosaway was a woman who got in debt to a neighbor in Tiverton, and was assigned to him as a servant to pay off that debt. Well, then this guy took her 6-year-old son and sold him as a slave to another colony, which was like this was a very common thing that happened, was like just selling young children, whether they were servants or the children of servants, selling them outside the colony to another place that had chattel slavery, even to a nearby colony far away from family who couldn't protect them and track them and try to defend their free status. That was the way that individuals were converted to enslavement. So Ruth actually was able to fight off this action in court regarding Toby, got him back. But then he was still bound as a servant to the individual who sold him away until age 21. And she herself, was bound. And she complained about sexual abuse. She complained about other sorts of problems within this household. So, she came out with a contract, at least, that determined how long she would have to serve. But her son was not going to serve to age 21, and the contract also gave Briggs, the individual that was trying to enslave them, the right to tack on expenses of rearing Toby onto Toby's eventual retirement contract. Sarah Chalkham was a biracial woman living in Rhode Island, working as a servant, when her master sold her as a slave to a buyer in New London. And on the bill of sale, he listed her as a mulatto. So Rhode Island had declared Indian slavery illegal. So what people often did was fudge the documents. And so you see Rhode Island using the Spanish terminology of musti and mulatto, are often then become associated with many of these individuals. Some of them were biracial and some of them weren't. One of the phenomena of the 18th century, we could talk about this some more, as the population of enslaved Africans increased in the 18th century. Because Indians are still the dominant slave population by far in the 17th century. Rhode Island had the most African slaves of all the colonies by 1708. Africans are about 5% of the population. But in the 18th century, the English colonists really get involved in the African slave trade much more aggressively, where slaves are brought to New England. So that population started to increase. And it's you see a lot more interracial relationships, intermarriage between Native Americans and African Americans in the 18th century. And these relationships have implications because the children of these unions are often the ones who are targeted for conversion to slavery, even when they identify as Native Americans. Sarah was also able to litigate and to challenge her enslavement, and she won her case because she could prove that her mother lived in Narragansett Reservation. But other Indians weren't so lucky. So I found, when I looked at court records, I found that as many as 2/3 of Indians who were brought to court in the 18th century were sentenced to servitude. Plymouth being particularly bad, but Newport as well. And these were almost entirely racialized activities by the 18th century. In the 17th century, sometimes the courts had sentenced English colonists to servitude. They pretty much stopped doing that in the 18th century. So this became a punishment pretty much dealt out to people of color, to Native Americans and Africans in this period. So sometimes people, were sentenced to servitude for debt, sometimes for petty crime, theft. So these weren't capital crimes. These are non-capital crimes. Oh, is there a class that has to leave? Do people need a quick break? Yeah. You take two. If you need to go, it's okay. I'm winding up. I'm winding down here.
Some people have
Yeah. And these sentences of servitude could be anywhere from 6 years to 30 years. They sometimes included provisions that allowed the owners to sell people into the Caribbean. These people's contracts were also sold at auction. So they were public land use, the sheriffs of hold, selling these people who had been sentenced by the courts. So these constant auctioning off of Indians, basically, sentenced by these courts. And often the justices of the peace, the people who are the town officials, were the ones who were buying them. So they had a terrible conflict of interest in terms of administering justice. And I have to say this was particularly true in Rhode Island. It's also true in other places, but there's some really, really egregious examples of the people in Rhode Island who are in charge of this stuff are really brokers of people. They're brokers of human beings. Now, the one sort of hopeful sign I start seeing in the 18th century is a rising number of freedom suits. As the children and grandchildren of the war captives from King Philip's War began to challenge their enslavement based on Rhode Island and Connecticut law. So one of these cases involved a man named Caesar, whose mother was in Narragansett, Wampanoag, or Pocasset, somebody who had been one of this refugee population from Rhode Island, who had been sold as a child in Connecticut and New London at an auction, one of these town auctions, and was purchased by a ship captain. Now, it's sort of like Ben's story. he died, his wife remarried, and as part of the estate, Caesar went into Long Island. So New York had very different slave laws. So the family didn't free the mother, even though she was supposed to be freed at the end of a set term. She married and formed a relationship with another enslaved person and had a son, Caesar, while in Long Island. The woman's husband died. The woman's husband died again. She remarried again, and so Caesar passed through a couple different owners, finally ending up working for a blacksmith in Windham, Connecticut. So Caesar just walked away from this one day, and with the help of some people I think are really proto-abolitionists, filed a petition in a justice's court in Connecticut. And the guy who heard this case was one of these people who was like a broker of Indian labor. And he had sentenced Indians to servitude. He had bought and sold Indians. He bought Indians contracts and had them working on his farm. He owned a slave, an African slave, and he did small-time slave wages himself to Barbados. I mean, this was not somebody who was a critic of slavery himself. But he sent this case to a jury. And Caesar won his jury trial. But if you see this, if you take a close look at this document, it says Caesar, does this have a, Caesar, a Musti, or Indian servant, or slave. So who is Caesar? What category did he fit? What's legal? You can see that the owner, the guy who's trying to claim Caesar, is like probably trying to lean over and say no, he's a mulatto, he's a Musti, But he says I was born of a squaw named Betty, who was a captive in the late Indian War and not a slave. So his petition was that she had been illegally kept in slavery. She was not freed when she should have been. Caesar was born after that event. So she wasn't a slave, but he was born, therefore he wasn't a slave. The jury agreed with him, and Caesar also wanted an appeal. So this is just one of many suits in this period. Another one involved a man named Elisha. Elisha couldn't even claim to be a New England Indian. His mother was a Spanish Indian. It was a woman who had been raided from a Spanish mission in Florida, who had been, in very harrowing circumstances, who had been sold to a ship's captain who brought her to Rhode Island. So she was enslaved in Rhode Island, had a child, Elisha, and Elisha ended up as a slave in Connecticut. So Elisha did the same thing. He ran away, filed a lawsuit, and also managed to maintain his freedom. So Elisha's suit was more controversial because he was not a New England Indian. So there was a sort of presumption or a desire to sort of protect the status of New England Indians, I think, in some of these local communities. But Elisha's case was sort of a breakthrough because he basically made a case that Indians in general shouldn't be enslaved. He was somebody's subject. If his mother wasn't the subject of the English king, that she was the subject of a Spanish king, or was a native Indian of North America, essentially, and should be a subject and a citizen. So they're making kind of proto-natural rights arguments, or arguments about the unenslavability of Indians. They're persuading their neighbors. So as the neighbors made slavery possible in the earlier period, they're starting to intervene and basically help people out of slavery, or at least support people's efforts to escape slavery in the 18th century. Now, I wouldn't say that these freedom suits ended Indian slavery or African slavery in New England or in Rhode Island. And in fact, in some ways, the vague law made abolition by statute difficult in New England. And Connecticut didn't abolish slavery until 1848 by statute. 1848. Rhode Island, Connecticut has very gradual abolition laws. They still implicate the children of the enslaved. It only applied to people after the law. And they have to keep passing these laws multiple times because they're sort of ineffective at freeing people. They force people to really engage in lawsuits to claim their freedom. That's how Massachusetts ends up ending slavery, is via litigation. And it's not like they broadcast that slavery's over. There's mass confusion in the community of the enslaved for decades, really, in the North. And individuals are trying to decide, what do I do? Do I try to file a lawsuit? It takes money, it takes social capital, it takes literacy. Do I just run away? What happens if I run away? Well, will I be captured? So there's still people being held in slavery into the early 19th century. That's the Native Americans and African Americans. So, I think it's crucial that enslaved people retain the right to testify against whites and to testify in court. That's something a right that was stripped away in many other slave societies. So the vagueness of the law at least meant that they kept that right to testify, which was really important to ending slavery for individuals and helping individuals contest their situation. But I think, as I said, these are very exceptional cases where people were able to escape slavery through litigation. And I think they are not, I wouldn't want you to think that they were typical of the experience. I think there are many more, they gave me insight into the process, into how things happen to many other people who don't enter into the records at all. All right, well, I'll stop here, try to give us some time to go to a break, and then I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. We do have a little bit of time for some questions if you'd be willing to field some.
Sure.
Discuss more the Spanish Indians. In particular, I guess the case of Elisha's mother sounds pretty extensive. I mean, is there
There's a huge file on them, actually. It's really fascinating. At first the lawyers tried to make the case that she's actually a Carolina Indian, which would make her an English subject. Pardon? Well, captured, yes, this is exactly when she's captured in the context of, she's captured by other Indians, but she was not captured in Carolina. I mean, there's tons of conflicting testimony on this one. Just the owner basically thinks that if he can establish she's a Spanish Indian, that he'll get to keep Elisha, because that no one will believe that Spanish Indians can't be enslaved. Like that the only argument can be that if she was a Carolina Indian, then maybe she was an English subject, because Carolina was sort of part of the English Empire. So people are making these arguments based on subjecthood in the 18th century in many ways. There's a whole group that are making the King Philip's War. This person was a captive. They were supposed to be freed after a set term, and they were held illegally in slavery. And I'm a descendant, therefore I should be freed. The Carolina Spanish Indians have a much tougher legal argument to make. They can only make us their subjecthood argument. And so the owner, Elisha's owner feels it's a slam dunk once he's got somebody testifying that she's a Spanish Indian, that no one will buy that. The jury sort of feels like, I think that at that point, Indianness is enough for that particular jury. And the fact that he's a known figure. He actually loses an intermediate judgment that they can't really bring him in. And his owner complains that he's walking around town and nobody will help him get this guy back. Like, so the community has sort of decided this guy's not a slave. So if the community can't be part of the police, then it's hard to hold people. There's certainly many other Carolina and Spanish Indians who were brought into New England and sold as slaves. There are Indians from Suriname, there's Indians from all over the world and they're not here. There's a massive trade in Indians in the Atlantic slave system. So, to me, that's what's really interesting in this case, is that the fact that she's a Spanish Indian doesn't, in the end, seem to matter that much. It's just that she's an Indian and that he was born in New England, and that's enough for a jury to decide they should be free.
I just wondered if any captives from Florida, for instance, said, we're vassals of the Crown of Castile or something.
Well, so yeah, so the lawyer
Indians.
actually says, yeah, she's the subject of some European, right?
Okay.
That they're, the subject of the Spanish king may be. I mean, that's one argument they make. But I think it's really kind of, Elisha's natalism, which in the end that kind of matters in that case too. But yes, to be subject to some monarch sort of matters by the middle of the 18th century.
And there's a whole file on the Spanish Indians, is that?
There's a giant file on this case actually in Connecticut, with like tons of testimony, random testimony. But people were really interested in her. Like there's a neighbor, an English neighbor that came over and heard, because like you wanted to hear the story. She told very vivid stories of the process of her captivity. So there's Spanish Indians on Martha's Vineyard that are in Mayhew's Christian conversion narratives. But that guy bought himself. He engaged in self-purchase and got himself free. But he's very alienated. I mean, he marries a Wampanoag woman on Martha's Vineyard, but I mean, he's depressed. I mean, he can't hardly communicate with her. He can't really communicate with the other Indians. He really misses. Tells vivid stories about his childhood, and he's really traumatized by his captivity and the dislocation. These Spanish and Carolina Indians often steal ships and try to go back. So they are involved in a bunch of really spectacular escapes that really border on insurrection in Boston and elsewhere in the 1710s and 1720s. Like big groups, on the move that get covered in the newspapers, and people, the Bostonian, everybody's really freaking out about these things because it's right around the time of the New York slave uprising. So that there's a sense of the insecurity that slave owners in South Carolina feel. These people in New England are feeling as well because it's. Yeah, sure.
When the anti-slavery starts building up, and we need to do something about slavery as an institution in America, is any element of that directed toward freeing Indians?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's sort of what I'm trying to say when I talk about these freedom cases. The fact that there's a bunch of lawyers in Connecticut who's really just started pushing these cases because they're trying to get the cases, if they when they're appealed, the Supreme Court in Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts is in fact the legislature. So what they're really trying to get pushed through is some kind of clarity that Indians can't be enslaved, and they never quite get that.
But is that in any of the literature against
Well,
slavery?
if you read, I think it's not so much in the it's not so much in the literature. I think African slavery, for good reason, in some ways dominates the literature, but the contemporaries knew. So Granville Sharp talked about Indian slavery.
Oh, he does.
Absolutely. If you look at the initial the founding documents of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society, other anti-slavery societies, Massachusetts, Indian and African slavery. Absolutely. They know it because that has been the predominant form of slavery for them. I mean, for most people outside of Newport, Providence, and Boston, Indian slavery is the kind, and their Narragansett country, Indian slavery is the sort of slavery they've seen in their day-to-day lives. It has been part of the fabric of their day-to-day lives. So that is, in fact, how they're. So these are the cases these early abolitionists are. I think they are abolitionists. I think they are an early wave of the abolitionist movement that's pushing things along because they think they can make a better case with Indians than they can with Africans, frankly.
Do you have any idea about what happens to that later? Because
almost
all of the anti-slavery stuff later is purely about African slavery.
I know. I think the numbers on African slavery become so great by the end of the 18th century.
Yeah.
I think because the Civil War, and I think by the 19th century, I think because the North is very slowly, poorly, has moved away from slavery and all of a sudden has recast itself as the place of abolition. There's a bit of a wipe of that memory, but actually in the 19th century even, a lot of people in New England are still talking about Indian slavery. So that the first wave of histories of King Philip's War, of the Pequot War, of these Indian wars, they all mention Indian captivity. And some of them are very critical. And in the context of abolitionism in the 1830s, they talk about this is an original sin for New England to have engaged in all this enslavement of Indians. That we are just like these other people that whose morality we're questioning now. So Indian slaves are figures in novels in the 19th century. I mean, people know. They show up in Hawthorne, they show up in the work of Captain Roy Sedgwick as the Indian slaves a main figure. What happens, I think the Civil War sort of, makes it all about that. And I think it was also the proportion of the population that Indians, became and are. I think it is Native American success at maintaining, maintaining some autonomy, cultural distinctiveness. I think that probably plays a role actually in that part of the forgetting as well. But I think it's a great question. Yeah, sure.
I have to be careful how I say this. So Roger Williams is better than the population. And I'm wondering, have you talked to Roger Williams scholars?
No. I mean, I've used their work and editions and things like that. I mean, I don't think he's better than the. No, I think my point is he's very implicated. In,
But see, that's the point I want to. Like I said, I want to be careful.
When
the result is evil, everyone gets blamed. So you have Roger, he's here, and the population's there, and Roger is a Democrat. He's not a king or anything. So we see him as the great leader. And so he's blamed for and praised for whatever happens. but almost everything, right down to freedom of religion. Roger works this out with the population. So on the enslavement, the end result is horrific, awful, terrible. But I urge you to dig a little deeper and you'll see that Roger, I'll give you a more personal example. I served on the parole board for 2 years, 400 decisions that were awful. I voted correctly in all 400 and lost 400 times. If you look at the results, I'm an evil person. And I'm telling you, Roger is a little more complex than, and final comment, I'll be quiet, because I have to also leave, but, so Massachusetts has pressure on him. It's not only that he wants to do bad things, he wants to keep the freedom of Rhode Island, and he's still worried about himself. When he first comes here, he's worried they're going to come snatch him. So I think Roger caves more than you think. Again, I'm not defending him. The end result's the end result, and it's horrific.
Well, he's one of the few people that, in the 1630s is like, is this a good idea? I'm not so sure. But, he does it all private. That there's very little public discussion about any of these decisions. But I think, I'm not trying to make a direct comparison, but, something like Thomas Jefferson, takes his position on slavery changes quite a bit over his lifetime. Right, and he takes different sorts of positions at different times. And the older he gets, the more, supportive of slavery, frankly, he gets. Yeah. So you might say that Williams, I see the Williams who's saying, is this the right thing to do? But he also is helping track down captives. And then by 1676, he's the one presiding over that town meeting under the tree. So I think the normalization of all the stuff for him,
See, I didn't want to get in this spot. I'm not defending anything.
Oh, I understand. No, you're trying to make it more nuanced and complicated.
Yeah, I'm suggesting to you, because you're going to be leading this discussion for the next 27 years, that you talk to some Roger Williams people.
All right, that's a good suggestion. I'll take it. Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name is Donna. Hi, Professor Fisher. And I am a direct descendant from the first land trust that Benjamin Church put 13 Indian families called Watuppa in Fall River as he was colonizing Little Compton. And in the history of my family, and I should say that we still live in the matriarchal way, I'm the 15th female generation to be the steward of the 5.5 acres that we were allotted because of our family size. And we're still living on Indian Town Road. And the reservation, the trust was put in place in 1709, before this was the United States of America. How we were placed amongst the Wardell family. A lot of them came down from Salem and all of those places and colonized and bought their pigs and thought we would be farmers. In retrospect, we had to be farmers to survive because we could no longer live on our natural waterways the way that our culture made us to. So my interest is, first of all, number one, the Hafen-Rathbur was founded on the King Philip's War and founded on my descendants' families. And yet, in discussing New England slavery and history, it's not exhibited to me, for me, in the retrospect of where it all began. And therefore, it's again not tilting to the true history of Native people being the first enslaved. It's jumping over generations of, and the thing that kind of like annoys me, it's not like when the Africans came, that's the first time that Africans came to the North American continent. They've been coming here for centuries before the English came. And Native people are mixed with all different Russians, Dutch, because they all came to trade, but they didn't go back. That's where we were stupid. We thought, oh, they're coming, yes, they brought us kettles, because then kettles last longer than our clay pots. And it's an even trade, and after a while, they'll go back. We didn't know that they were a nation, a group of people that had no nation to go back home to. And thence, we befriended them, thinking that they would honor us as we watched them not only take our lands by any means necessary, but begin the ultimate, biggest lie in the history of the United States of America, as far as I'm concerned. Because the only people that seem to have this pure blood is Native American people on a continent that is their homeland. And so I want to have more research and really would like to work with you to really go into detail about the 13 families that we were all mixed with everything in this area, even pre-King Philip's War. Because you'd be marrying your first and second cousins, and you'd be having lots of retarded kids. So the Narragansetts and the Pokanokets and the Nipmunks and the Abenakis, the Mohawks, we all married into each other. And there's no such thing as a mixed blood Indian. And I will never call myself that until white people call themselves mixed blood.
Well, let's talk after the talk, and I'd like to get your info.
Okay.
There's also, I know the Little Compton Historical Society has some.
Marjorie's right here.
Exactly. I was going to say, I'm sure you two should talk, or you already have. But yeah.
Yes, and Bill Simmons, my grandfather was a medicine man in the 1800s. William Pequot Pelewanko Perry, that Bill Simmons writes about in his book, The Spirit of the New England Tribes. So I'm on that line, and there is a movement happening in southeastern New England, and not just in southeastern New England, I think across the North American continent, where Native women are now becoming the PhDs and doing research on our own history. And it can now be compared. The history can be compared with how we actually were raised to live. Those stories, those oral stories on how my people shared our history can now be compared to what is written by people who were observers. And most of the time what they wrote was inaccurate. And now we have to go back and convince people as First Nation people that our story is the truthful story. So I definitely want to talk with you.
Drag something in here. I'm kind of familiar with what happened to indigenous first people all across the country. I grew up in the Midwest and I lived most of my adult life in Southern California. It's so funny, I was just thinking when you were talking about, just the whole issue of slavery and economic interest. In California, what you had, of course, was much later, in 1769, when they decided they were going to sweep up. It was basically trying to baptize as many Indians as they could. That way you could claim that they were Catholic and that therefore you owned the territory because you were using people as, whatever, I don't know, fence posts or something. And then they did that very fast because they were worried about the Russians coming down, the English coming in and everything, and so they wanted the territory. And so I look at that, and of course that was one area of Catholicism. And then you look at the nationwide with the federal government assigning different Indian nations to different churches for the boarding schools and all that whole movement. And then you back up to what's going on here, and somebody was talking about, defending Roger Williams. Shortcut there, I hope that's okay. So, and then you've got all the stuff that's going on within the churches here, despite you've got all the guys who are just traders and stuff like that. I mean, the ones who want money and they don't care if it's beaver pelts or humans. But I always look back at the various modes of Christianity and what effect that has on how Indians were treated in various areas. And I didn't really hear too much of that. I was wondering if you had anything more to add for this area about that.
You know, I'm not really doing a comparative piece here. I'm really sort of zeroing in on the New England context. You know, what I'd say is that all European colonists are enslaving Indians. I mean, it is. You know, we're putting together a map of North America at this point. Mm-hmm. So the French did it in a certain way. You know, the English do it a certain way in New England. The English in the Carolinas do it a different way. But you know, so that there are a lot of regional differences. There are a lot of different experiences. But religion does not seem to be the major. The European religion does not seem to be the major.
I was wondering
distinction.
If there's you don't find that in the New England area. You don't find
no.
well, like it is in some areas.
Yeah,
in
I
some
mean, I
later
think
times.
people who write on the Caribbean and some people who look at slavery in Spanish America might say that, you know, religion sometimes gave people, well, I mean, in the early, say in the, you know, I mentioned Bermuda and Barbados, for a little while you could claim Christian conversion and get out of enslavement, but then that stops. And they close that loophole. I think there are some people who've talked about ways in which being part of a faith community for Catholics might get you, you know, some leverage in ecclesiastical courts to complain about bad treatment, physical mistreatment, if it made you suicidal. That you know, if you're being tortured to the point of suicide, that the church should intervene and stop your master from driving you to commit a moral sin. I mean, so there are people who have talked about these faith communities as ways of trying to mitigate. But I think I think there's certainly differences in the ways that religion worked and in the experiences of evangelization with Native Americans, and then the majority of New England Indians remain free. I mean, they are a community it is influencing the system too. They're trying to mitigate it. They are trying to protect their relatives, get their relatives out of enslavement, provide support, maintain cultural connection as much as they can. So I'd say that's probably more important than in a particular, religious function. I thought there'd be a lot more. I mean, this is something that Lynn Fisher works on, so he may be able to answer this question better than I can. I thought there'd be just a lot more discussion and debate on the ethics and morality of this, and there's almost none. So I think that part of the reason why they started evangelizing the Indians is because of the Pequots in their homes. They actually say this, like, we better start our evangelization program because these people are living in our house and they're talking about, Nikomo and Hemlock and all this other stuff. That the drive for acculturation comes in part because of slavery.
I'm very sorry, I don't want to cut off the conversation, but we do have another event coming into the room shortly thereafter. So please, I hope the conversation continues out in the hallway, and please, if you're interested, please purchase a copy of the book. Please join me in thanking Professor Noel Wallace.